give everyone the idea of what this is about, and then I hope to also show some new work that we've been doing in the last year or so. Um, and yes, I mean I should apologize in advance. I'm a psychologist, so I focus on individuals, but I try to scale it up. You know, the most common critique we get from sociologists is we focus too much on the individual level. So, you know, we try to scale it up a little bit at the end, hopefully. Um, Depending on the crowd that I'm talking to, I mean, I don't know, with the current state of the world, perhaps obvious that misinformation is a problem. Of course, during the pandemic, there were wild conspiracy theories, especially here in the UK, linking the coronavirus to 5G, which led people to set phone masts on fire during the pandemic. In Iran, people were hospitalized. The number of excess hospitalizations due to false reports on social media that drinking methanol would cure the virus, including lots of children who were hospitalized, you know, obviously very bad. We had the Southport riots here in the UK last or about a year ago now, based on a false report that you know there was a tragedy which was exploited by bad actors suggesting it was an immigrant who arrived by boat, and you know that was a fake story but led to massive anti-immigration protests and violent attacks. Of course, we've had Russian disinformation about the invasion in Ukraine. This went viral on Facebook. This is actually Southern California. This is a cheap fake. Of course, Putin's claim that, you know, he was targeting Nazis, the Capitol riots in the United States, Israel Hamas, which, you know, has been going on for over 2 years now. RFK Jr. Spreading misinformation from the top down inside the U.S. government. Um, National disasters, climate change driven wildfires. I've seen a rise in AI generated fakery during, you know, emergency situations. So I hope it's sort of clear that misinformation during times of crises is a particular problem that is uh, at least seems useful for us to address. I remember before the current political environment, sometimes, especially when I engage with philosophers, they would sort of say, "Oh, didn't we always have misinformation? What's so unique about the current landscape?" But I feel everyone who was a little bit critical of that has now come around being quite alarmed about the state of things and the amount of disinformation that we're seeing around the world across conflicts, pandemics, and elections. But I'm not a, I should say, you know, I'm not a fact checker, but I'm interested in the tropes of propaganda, the sort of the psychology of how these techniques have been used over time. And so this is an interesting picture for me because this is a gentleman in the US during the pandemic who claimed that the mRNA vaccine, which of course the US is now getting rid of, um, and no doubt partly motivated by crazy conspiracy theories that it's changing your DNA, right? So there's a sort of difference between new technology and people asking legitimate questions and the sort of history of propaganda. And so what's interesting to me is that if you go back to the 1800s, the development of the first vaccine, which was the cowpox vaccine against smallpox, which was Edward Jenner, who came up with the first modern vaccine. And during his time, there were already anti-vaccine activists, right? There have been anti-vaccine activists since the beginning of modern vaccines, and they would come up with these very graphic paintings that would suggest that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you would turn into a human cow hybrid. So here's one of those images where you see, you know, udders sprouting out of people's eyes and ears, and the you know, it's basically fear mongering about the vaccine, right? Don't take the vaccine because it's going to change your DNA. Of course, they didn't have the word DNA, but the trope was that it was going to change your body. It was a scary thing. And somehow, you know, 200 years later, some of these techniques are still being recycled, and we fail to anticipate them somehow. And that's kind of my interests. The same with climate change and you know the sowing doubt technique of the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry. It's a repeated technique that you know casting doubt about the scientific consensus was effective on obscuring the link between smoking and cancer for the tobacco industry. Then the fossil fuel industry adopted the same technique. Then some of the COVID actors adopted the same technique. Naomi Oreskes has a great book called Merchants of Doubt that goes into detail about this. But I'm sort of interested in these larger techniques. But when you ask regular people, can they spot fake news? And sometimes it's funny to do this one live. So all of these stories are widely reported. Two of them are fake. If I ask you which one's true, A, Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. B, baby born in California was named hard eyes emoji. Or C, criminal farts so loudly he gives away his hiding place. Um, Now, people have a surprising amount of confidence in Putin, it seems, because most people tend to say B when you do this live. In fact, I gave this talk in California last year, and most people in California also think the right answer is B, because it somehow seems that this is something that would happen in California, that somebody would name their baby hard eyes emoji. But actually, the actual answer is C. So a criminal was hiding from the sheriff's department in Missouri, and he was hiding in the bushes, and he passed gas so loudly that he did give away his own hiding spot. And actually, the sheriff's department tweeted, when you're having a hashtag shit day. And so sometimes, the truth is smellier than fiction. And so the idea here is, though, is how do you discern? This is a kind of a, fart joke example, but it's kind of motivated us over the years to look at the field more generally. Because what happens in this field of research is that people just make up headlines. They pull them from the internet, Facebook, Twitter. They make their own, and we were doing that as well. And you ask people to rate them. But unlike other areas of psychology where you have psychometrically validated skills, personality assessment, clinical psychology, right? There's no validated scales in this space, which makes standardization and comparison actually quite difficult. So we spent a few years actually coming up with the misinformation susceptibility test, which is called the MIST. Now the MIST was benchmarked according to the US and UK populations initially. We did both a sort of standard psychometric IRT type of validation, but also exploratory graph analysis, sort of using more newer kind of graphic methods to think about clustering of items. These were actually created by AI. So long before ChatGPT became popular, we used GPT-2 at the time. And we already noticed back then that it was remarkably accurate at generating fake headlines that sound as if they could be true. Um, and the important thing for us was that, in the field more generally, when you ask people, is this true, is this fake, or, how accurate is this? If people just retrieving something from memory because they've seen it before, then that's not a test of their underlying knowledge. That's just a memory retrieval exercise, right? So every study that just pulls headlines from social media has this sort of memory confound. So that we wanted to avoid that. And so that's why we created the headlines with an AI, so we could be sure that nobody's ever seen them before. Um, and then, there's lots of reasons to be skeptical of a validated news scale. News changes. News is different in different countries, right? Some of these things might not translate well. But at least in the UK and the US, where the news environment is pretty similar, we were able to do test, retest over several years, and came up with this measure. And I'll show you some of the items. In fact, we just published a paper with my Swedish collaborator, Thomas Nygren at Uppsala University. It's called the SMIST, the Swedish MIST. So for those who are interested, this came out this week. There's a Swedish version of the MIST. We actually did a larger article on how to use neural networks for automatic item generation and psychological skill development. Turns out to be a hugely useful tool for those who are interested in the underlying method. But here's some of the items. Certain vaccines are loaded with dangerous chemicals and toxins. YouGov adopted the MIST to benchmark it in nationally representative samples. 40% of the US population thinks that that's true, right? So some of these are quite mind-boggling in terms of what people would endorse. I mean, lots of people also say that they're wrong. So people do okay on average, but there's some clustering and some particular items that are a bit shocking. But overall, people are they're better than 50-50, right? So some people have skills that other people don't have. So there's a latent tendency that varies. And if you correlate it with some simple things like where do people get their news, the lowest scoring quartiles or deciles and people get their news from Snapchat and Truth Social. Of course, the best scoring people get their news from NPR, Associated Press, because it's all part of the mainstream media conspiracy. right? The only reliable news is found on X these days. We all know that. But just being sarcastic there. Don't quote me directly. One of the interesting things is, and we've recently published a paper on this. So hundreds of thousands of people go through our online app, right? So we could gather big data on this test. Um, and we just published a paper in Personality and Individual Differences, where we looked at performance and predictors, and consistently younger people do worse on this test, and the gap is quite significant, which is quite interesting. Gen Z in particular. Um, and it correlates with the fact that they're much more likely to get their news from social media, but it's not a causal factor, obviously. And so, ideological extremes also do worse, particularly right-wing extremism, and some other factors. But yeah, so the main contribution was to give the field actually a standardized instrument that can be used. And there are some downsides to the scale, so we've developed different versions of it for different purposes. Um, then people always ask, okay, but what is misinformation? So I shared a consensus report for the APA, which is governs my field, to try to figure this out with people that I knew wouldn't necessarily agree with each other, and it was a very long, painstaking process. Not something APA is wonderful, but I'm not sure if I ever want to lead such an endeavor again, because getting academics to agree on something can be quite difficult. But what we settled on was that misinformation is information that's either demonstrably false or otherwise misleading. And I think it's important to pause there for a second because um, all of this debate in the field of misinformation kind of hinges on definitions. So people who say, but misinformation isn't prevalent, they're talking about stuff that's demonstrably false, right? So if you categorize, quantify stuff on social media, fact check misinformation, Earth is flat type of stuff, yeah, that doesn't make up the majority of most people's news feed. That's not really surprising, right? But if you include under the definition of misinformation, misleading information, which is hyperpartisan, conspiratorial, polarizing rhetoric, low credibility, logical fallacies, manipulation, then you get a much larger and much more substantial segment of people's news diet. And so we wanted to be inclusive and say, look, misinformation isn't just stuff that's utterly false; it's also stuff that's misleading. And I'll show you why I think that's important in a second. Um, and regardless of source or intention, right? So disinformation is intentional misinformation, but difficult to prove. There's legal processes. It takes a while to establish intent, right? You have to document and prove that sometimes in court. And so that can be tricky. And so we said misinformation, right? We're sidelining intent for the moment. But the important part is regardless of source, mainstream sources can sometimes also publish misinformation. The New York Times falsely published headlines that claimed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq for years, which to this day has led to misperceptions about the war in Iraq. They apologized for that and said that was misinformation. We've corrected it and now we're moving on. That's what a good editorial outlet does, right? The bad faith ones, they keep publishing misinformation and never apologize. But still, if you look at studies, BBC on climate, they platform climate deniers for a long time under the false balance media norm, right? We have to have some opposing voice to the scientific consensus. Same with vaccines. We know psychologically extremely damaging, right? When you tell people the signs on vaccines, and then you have one mother on who is telling an emotional anecdote about how their child may have gotten autism from a vaccine, that science just goes out the window in the face of an emotional anecdote. Um, and so that was a very harmful practice. BBC apologized for that. They discarded it. They moved on. But I guess the point that I'm making is that misinformation coming from mainstream outlets is much more damaging than from some fake news website. And I think most of the literature also looks at super spreaders, right? Most of the misinformation comes from the top, from elites that are influential, not necessarily always from regular people. And so the influence that comes with the authority and the credibility, I think, is important. So if you look at some studies by Jenny Allen and Dave Rand and others, actually looked at this on Facebook. They sort of combined experimental evidence about exposure to misinformation on vaccination intentions with what actually went viral on Facebook. And they found that the fact-check misinformation, sure, has negative impacts on vaccine intentions. But the stuff that was questionable but not fact-checked as utterly false the impact on vaccination intentions was 50 times larger than that of fact-checked misinformation. So here's an example of the specific headline that was one of the most shared stories on Facebook. Healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating, right? So Chicago Tribune, it's not a fake news outlet. That's a Pulitzer Prize winning outlet. A healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting a COVID vaccine. So that's not technically false. But what's going on here, and this is what's of interest to me, is there's a clear manipulation technique, right? There is a correlation causation fallacy that's being implied through framing, right? That the doctor died. It's worded and organized in such a way that it leads people to think that the vaccine had something to do with the doctor dying in a causal connection, whereas there was no evidence for that at any point in time. CDC investigates every claim it gets, so it's nothing special about this particular claim, right? So it's also out of context. It's clickbait. There's many things wrong with it, but they all fall under the umbrella of misleading rather than overtly false. And so that's kind of the content that I'm most interested in, and that's what a lot of our interventions are about. Because I feel like, we've got the fake news, outright fake news covered pretty well by some existing interventions. So we wanted to focus on the sort of broader category of misleading news and then how to counter that. And if you look at the literature, most of the stuff that's being done was at the time, this talking almost a decade ago now, so it's quite some time ago. But still, fact checking and debunking are prevalent. Those are the tools most people think of. And if you look at meta-analyses of this literature, this one's a bit contested from Dolores Albarathin at UPenn sort of showed a zero effect of debunking science-related misinformation. Now, there's been a response to this saying that there was a lot of heterogeneity and like it depends on how you categorize things. And I think the critique is fair, but I think that the point that's generally being made is that fact-checking and debunking reduces but does not eliminate misperceptions, and that's called the continued influence of misinformation. If you look at neurological evidence of this, when you put people in a scanner and you give them a scenario that you then later debunk, there are two things that go wrong. And again, it's not so clear if there's a dominating view, but there's some evidence for both. Is that one, there's an integration error. People do not link the correction to the myth in their memory network. And this is one problem. The other problem is that when we access information in the brain, we access true and false information concurrently, and you have to actively suppress the false information through some tag in your memory, a negation, right? And negations are hard for people. And so lots of things go wrong during retrieval. So people are not retrieving the correction, but they're activating the misinformation. And so when you're debunking, you're always in a disadvantageous position because now you have to repeat the misinformation and say it's not true. And then some people just say it's not true. That often doesn't work because then people don't know what's true instead, and you're just repeating the myth. So you're strengthening because your memory is like a social network, right? There's links and there's nodes, and so you're just strengthening the links between the nodes by reactivating them, but you're not giving people an alternative. So the best types of debunks give people compelling alternatives of what to believe instead. But if it doesn't align with their worldview, if people don't like it, if it's too long, too complex, they might still not integrate it in a good way. So there's lots of potential for failure, and that's I think what explains why debunking helps but doesn't fix the problem. That's kind of the general conclusion. So for all of those reasons, we've kind of started looking at this idea of pre-bunking. So trying to preemptively prevent people from encoding misinformation into their brains in the first place. And that you can do that now in lots of ways. People have been creative in how you can pre-bunk. We originally did it through this social psychological theory known as psychological inoculation, which follows the vaccination analogy. And this, when we first started doing this, 9 years ago, this sounded quite crazy and radical to fact checkers. The idea is that you actually expose people to a weakened dose of misinformation or the techniques used to produce misinformation, and then you deconstruct and refute them in advance so people can build up cognitive or mental antibodies. Just as vaccines introduce a weakened version of a pathogen to try to trigger the production of antibodies, right, to help confer resistance against future infection, turns out you can do the same with the brain, right? So your brain needs lots of examples of what deception looks like in weakened form in order to mount an effective immune response. And it needs to know the DNA of the misinformation in order to find and neutralize it, right? That's the underlying sort of logic. Um, And that's also why I think inoculation works well in some contexts and sometimes less well in others. When there's no discernible quote unquote RNA or DNA to detect, when you're not able to predict, your psychological immune system is going to struggle to identify it if you cannot administer clearly weakened doses in advance that deconstruct and break things down. Um, and so that's kind of the idea. I wrote it. So the psychological inoculation has two components, just to contrast it to biological inoculation for a second. So you have to forewarn people of some impending threat. That's to trigger a motivational process or the sort of deception monitoring, right? That people think that their attitudes are being challenged in some way, so they're paying attention, more sort of type two central processing, and then you administer the pre-bunk, which was originally called a preemptive refutation. You preemptively refute a future falsehood. We relabel that pre-bunking because it's easier to understand. And then people build up these antibodies, which you can measure, right, through better information discernment, how motivated people are, their memory of the material, the longevity, and you can model lots of things associated with the immunization strategy, just as you do with biological vaccines. And I don't I don't want to spend too much time going through all the lab experiments because I feel I can answer questions about that. But the basic paradigm is you invite people to the lab, you give them the pre-bunk, you let them browse the internet, and you find people become more resistant after the session, right? That's just the basic sort of well-replicated paradigm. There were lots of questions, after we did those experiments. Okay, but don't you have the same problem as with fact checking that you can't pre-bunk every single claim? Okay, but people are not going to come to the lab to receive a psychological vaccination. So how are you going to deliver this in the real world somehow? Um, how long does it last? Does it transfer across different issues? So we decided that we actually needed a new way of trying to do this because we initially took McGuire. So Bill McGuire was a social psychologist who came up with this during um, the Korean War. And he had this idea. The U.S. government was sort of obsessed with soldiers getting brainwashed by foreign troops and defecting to China and so on. And so they thought that they didn't have the facts about America. The U.S. government was like, they need to know, they need a pamphlet with all the facts about why America is so great. And McGuire actually said, no, I think they need a simulated attack of what it's like to be set in a dark room and somebody trying to brainwash you. That's kind of what they need. And we took that critical element, because to me, that's actually Maguire's stroke of genius, not so much how he did it specifically. It's that idea of the simulated attack that forms the analogy to the vaccine. And so we took that idea and then created a game with it. And that was our solution at the time. And so we got all these funny headlines. Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans. The news especially love that potential. No offense. But they even called asking if this was fake news. Which I don't know. I guess the reader should determine. We took some inspiration from Severus Snape. So they started calling us the Defense Against the Dark Arts Lab, some library at Cambridge, which was kind of funny at the time. It's less funny now with the whole J.K. Rowling, debate. So I've made it more my ode to Alan Rickman, who I did appreciate as an actor. But he said you must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo, which I do think was a crucial insight because this was not my generation, but reading the books. It occurred to me that in the dark arts class, you actually had to experiment with the dark arts. It was kind of dangerous. You had to overcome it actively, not sort of read things in a book like media literacy sort of lesson. And so that inspired this idea behind bad news, which some people may be familiar with. If not, I'll walk you through it. Bad news is a simulated social media environment. It was the first fake news game at the time. Um, and the idea was simple, actually. We took a perspective taking exercise to do the sort of the dark arts part and let people step into the shoes of an online manipulator and familiarize yourself with weakened doses of manipulation techniques and let people deconstruct and neutralize them on their own throughout the experience. So it was a form of active inoculation, giving people agency, and also. We spend time interviewing people who do this for a living, people who work in Russian troll farms, extremists, neo-Nazis. So we talk to people who use these strategies and how they used them to get a sense of how we could administer broader techniques. So the idea behind the game was actually that in the experiments, in the old school experiments, you pre-bunk a specific claim, and then people are less likely to believe that claim. Voila. But the big question was like transfer, right? What if we could get at the underlying DNA of this stuff? So what if we take the ingredients of a conspiracy theory? Because many of them have the exact same template, right? Evil people are plotting behind the scenes, somebody goes missing, right? Avril Lavigne is a clone. Tupac Shakur is still alive on an island somewhere. Princess Diana. It's always the same sort of story. So what if we take the building blocks and use that as the weakened dose, and then target people with lots of examples of different conspiracy theories? Do you get this sort of broad spectrum immunization? That was kind of the idea. So here's an example of bad news. So your goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing credibility. Here you're impersonating Donald Trump. So the great thing about games, you can update them in response to real news. So after the election, I'm back. Great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. Um, Now, John Rosenbeek, who created this game with me, who wrote the content, created this as a joke 3 years ago. So I think we might have to update this now that Trump has actually made some insinuations of, because we were like, what's something that sounds Trumpian, but he didn't actually say, but now he's actually said it more or less. So we might have to come up with a different joke. But the goal actually here is to distract people from the technique with the content because it's not about the content, it's about the fact that the Twitter handle is manipulated, which is part of what we call impersonation. So we look at impersonation, impersonating politicians, celebrities, organizations, right? Gaining credibility, using faking credibility to gain influence. So if you're being too ridiculous in this game, then you lose points, right? Mainstream media is one massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. Here we have Elon Musk, Doge investigation confirms Prime Minister Keir Starmer was inspiration for Mr. Darcy from hashtags Bridget Jones' Diary. What else are the Brits hiding? This is trolling. Elon is the king of trolling, right? So he's a kind of a funny example to use. So everything's fictional in this game, right? So it's weak in doses. Here you're impersonating NASA. You start trending. People respond to you. It's interactive, right? So you gain a following. You become the editor-in-chief of a fake news outlet, and you work the filter bubble. And so you go through these stages: polarization, polarizing groups in society, impersonating others, conspiracy theories, trolling, emotional manipulation, discrediting the mainstream by sowing doubt and denial, right? Um, and this is fitted to manipulation, right? You can discredit disinformation actors through science and investigative journalism and forensics. But that's not the type of discrediting we're talking about here. There are specific propaganda techniques, right? Deflection, denial, and so on. Um, so again, it's all based on real stuff. Somebody faked Warren Buffett online that went viral on the old Twitter. The same technique as I showed you with Trump. They misspelled his name. So it has ecological validity in that they're all based on real examples, but it's fictional. Then this game went viral on the internet by chance in some ways. Here's John Rosenbeek, and who's also fluent in Swedish, by the way. Just a random factoid for you guys. But I think he studied in Sweden, and so the game went viral, which allowed us to gather data. So there's a quiz in the game, a pre-post quiz, very simple quiz, and it's a 7-point scale that asks people how accurate, trustworthy, manipulative they find something. We vary the wording from test to test, and we don't want to promote the sort of simplistic thinking about true false because that's not the stuff that we're talking about, right? It's more about calibrating people's judgments. How trustworthy is this based on the presence or absence of media manipulation? Um, we had about 30,000 people initially, data points, sorry, about 50,000 paired people, just pre-post, 20-minute game, pre-post, very simple design. So you can see here, credible statements that are not manipulative, people find highly reliable before, after playing. But for the ones that use the manipulation techniques, people find them significantly less reliable after playing. Here's the density plots, the violent plots, left, right, young, old. People start at different levels, but the intervention effect was similar. There were no interactions. Now, of course, criticism, like, oh, but look, density is already low. People opt into the game. They're open to learning. You only had a few items. All true. We just created this. It was a science experiment run wild on the internet. It went viral on Reddit. They crashed our service. After we professionalized this, we started doing randomized controlled trials. Um, with placebo groups. And Raccoon, who was a student now at Oxford, led a lot of this research. And so we pre-registered all of these trials, and then we had this. It's always the same paradigm. So I'll explain to you once. So people are randomized to bad news or a gamified control like Tetris that everyone knows, but unrelated to misinformation. They get an 18-item quiz. Six techniques, 3 item per technique for reliability purposes. So 18 items in treatment control. And then they get the same post-test. And then we followed up with people week after week after week. This is called in the inoculation literature, this is called the attack phase. So you attack people with misinformation in the form of threatening sort of presentation quiz, and you ask people to rate it again, all the way until the post-test, 2 months later. In the second group, we didn't follow up with people until the very end. And in the third group, we changed the items after every testing phase just to make sure it's not memory or something like that. So, everything's on the OSF, by the way. It's all open data. People can play around with it. As you can see here, these are density plots. It's shifting to the left. People find fake news on average less reliable. This is the average of the scale of all the 6 techniques. There is some technique level variations, not particularly interesting, but there is some variation. This is the average though of everything. So there was no decay. Treatment control difference at the end of 2 months, but no decay. So I said to Raccoon, I mean, this seems implausible. Even COVID vaccines in the real world need boosters. By the way, Raccoon's PhD was all about the decay curve of this intervention. So if there's no decay, that was kind of a problem. So in a way, we're a bit motivated to find decay, but actually it wasn't too hard because in the second experiment, we actually did find decay. So here you can see that there's still a treatment control difference, but now people find misinformation more reliable again. There's about a 50% decay here that's happening. So what was unique about the second experiment is actually, it turns out, we didn't engage people in between at all. We just followed up with people at the end. And so we learned later through the rest of Raccoon's PhD, actually, which he published last year in Nature Comms, is actually what was happening was we were boosting people in between with this quiz. Because the two underlying mechanisms that we discovered that underlie the effectiveness of inoculation is memory and motivation. So people forget, that's one, you can model the forgetting curve, and two, people lose motivation. So in this other paper, we tried to independently boost motivation and memory along the way. It was a very complicated longitudinal design with lots of treatments and time points and whatnot. But the basic idea was let's model the decay curve and then see if we could independently boost it to preserve the effect. And here's some of the results from the key experiments. You can see the decay curve in green here, right? So it's exponential. So people are so unlike a real vaccine, which actually takes time and then immunity goes up, with the psychological one, it actually goes down, right? And so people lose the immunity pretty quickly after about 10 days. So it lasts about 10 days naturally. But then you can boost. So here's the booster group. The booster group actually, if you compare this, it's slower, but it's non-significant to the starting point. So actually, it's pretty good. And you can see that here too. Now, the most successful booster was actually the memory booster. Somehow we kind of failed. Well, there are two ways you can interpret this. One, motivation doesn't matter as much, or two, we failed to manipulate motivation successfully. What we did find is that motivation heavily predicts memory, which is interesting. So you're not going to memorize stuff if you're not motivated, I guess. So that's kind of the memory motivation model that we developed from this paper. We tried to make it more realistic by incorporating social and political information. Cecilia, who's now assistant professor in Copenhagen Business School in the digitalization department, did a lot of this work. So she took our headlines. This is an example of conspiracy, uber creepy, tracking your every move, which we made up. But then she randomized the headline, CNN or Fox News. Or fake news. You can see my own bias coming through. So you can see that in the US these are the most polarized outlets, right? So it was kind of an identity manipulation. And what's interesting is that inoculation works as expected pre-post here in control, where there is no source cues present. Now, this is matched to the ideology people declared at the beginning of the experiment. So if CNN or Fox News matches your identity, people find misinformation more reliable. So identity congruent misinformation is seen as more reliable. There's still a treatment effect, but it's lower. That it's hard to see, but it's actually lower than in the control. And out and same for outgroup. So yeah, this is discernment between the two. So the basic message is that yeah, people struggle more when it's identity congruent, but it doesn't fully eliminate it. So there's something positive about it. Then we started translating this intervention together with the UK government at the time, who helped connect us to organizations on the ground in different countries, including Sweden. Um, and so we've translated this into every major country in the world by now, during intergroup conflicts as well. So we have Ukraine, Russia, Hebrew, India. And so we try to, help citizens in those countries identify propaganda from whichever side, it may come, even your own side. And so that's kind of the idea. This was a group in India that independently replicated the bad news game to a T almost, the same effects that I showed you earlier in India. So I thought this was really good. But then I learned the cross-cultural replications of this were actually much trickier. So interestingly, what we found out basically is that in large urban areas with kind of English-speaking citizens, whether that's Brazil, India, or Africa, continent-wise, the results are very similar to the West. But if you go to rural areas, it doesn't work. So we did a randomized controlled trial in rural India, for example, did not work at all. There were some other issues that we had. It's very difficult to implement, data quality, there's hard to control, lots of misunderstandings, mostly our fault. So then we did a new campaign recently with videos in India, which had better success, but it took us years of adaptation to try to figure out how to do this in areas where people just have a completely different understanding of news, media, and so on. Um, We've done field trials in Swedish schools. Um, and so pre-post, these are educational psychologists interested in how can you implement this in the classrooms. So is it better individually, in pairs, class? Didn't matter. Turns out there was no group effect. But on average, this is the average type of effect size, zero point 0.3 in the standardized sort of D. People find fake news more manipulative. They find real news more credible, sort of a small effect on finding real news more credible as well. Some qualitative data, which is kind of interesting. So people focus less on sources and more on negative strategies, which is kind of what the intervention's meant to do. So that's good. But then there was also some interesting increase in nonsense responding that some students just don't seem engaged, which helped us sort of think about, how can we make sure the whole class is engaged? Because there's always going to be a couple of jokers in the classroom who don't think that this is funny for some reason. Hard to understand because we worked so hard on our boomer humor. And so, we try to sort of adapt it to different audiences better. There's been meta-analyses of this stuff, frequentist meta-analysis. Again, this is typical smallish effect size, but pretty stable. Then there were some interesting critiques. So some people said you need to use signal detection theory, which personally I'm a bit skeptical of because the way that it's applied. So we have calibrated ratings, right? From trustworthy to 1 to 10, 1 to 7, right? Signal detection theory is about binary stuff. Do you have the disease or not, right? And so can you detect a signal? And the good thing is you can disentangle signal detection from response bias, which is the important part, right? So the idea as well, maybe if people go through these interventions where you haven't disentangled, is that people could just say true to everything, or they could say false to everything, and that's a whole category response bias, right? Um, and you need to disentangle that from the discernment of being better able to discriminate. And I think that's interesting. But I think the way that they've applied it in the literature, in this literature more generally, is wrong. And I'm pretty harsh on that in the sense that, signal detection theory, the simple stuff, the way usually people do it, has a mutual exclusivity assumption, right? Either you're in the category or you're not. But most news media doesn't operate that way, right? It's half true, it's somewhat true. So and that's a major violation of the framework. So we spent a couple of years trying to figure out how could you do this. So we came up, and Almok Simchon is the one who came up with this. I'm not going to go through the whole sort of framework, but he came up with a hierarchical Bayesian framework that actually preserves the ordinal data structure of the models. So you preserve the 1 to 7, 1 to 10. You create many thresholds in that sense, and then you use a mixed effects model to estimate discrimination and bias. So the typical D prime and C discrimination bias that you get becomes so discrimination becomes the slope, right, in the model, and response bias becomes the intercept. And now you have a flexible framework also because you can include item level variation. A lot of the items don't have the same level of reliability in these types of studies. You can include participant variation as random effects, right? So you have a much more powerful, flexible framework. Bayesian allows you to quantify uncertainty around the response bias stuff. So really neat framework. This forthcoming next week in Current Opinion, where we took all of our inoculation experiments as a meta-analysis. So we know that there's no publication bias in the sense that both published, unpublished. And here it's a bit hard to see, I guess, but here are sort of the results. So discrimination is about zero point 0.3, pretty much consistent with all the other meta-analyses, so unsurprising there. So that's consistent. But the response bias tells a very different story. So sometimes it's more liberal, sometimes it's more conservative. You can see there's huge variation. So sometimes people uniformly become more likely to say things are true, sometimes more false, but on average, it's actually not significant. It's about zero. These are within study designs. These are between study designs, the lower panel. So again, discrimination pretty much the same. Response bias is zero. It's 0.03, but also not significant. And they're all on the line of zero. And so what's interesting actually is that there you do get some individual variation, but it's not consistent, and the uncertainty around it is pretty big in terms of which direction it can go. But overall, it doesn't appear to be a significant problem. But we have experimented with how to reduce the heterogeneity, the variation. So one of the key things that we've implemented in our games is feedback. So just as your immune system learns from feedback on which are the healthy cells and which are the invaders, if you give people a little bit of feedback to counter sort of these response bias tendencies, say, hey, look, dude, Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? You have to pay attention to manipulation and not just be skeptical because that's not, or cynical, or as we like to say, be skeptical but not cynical. Um, that actually creates a much more homogeneous response pattern in terms of responding. Here's the ROC curve, the area under the curve, so you can see that um, you know in the post test, which is the yellow area, people improve without increasing false alarms. So this is the hit rate against the false alarm rate, and that's true for both types of designs. So overall, it's looking pretty good. That was our idea. We created a version for kids. And then I want to be mindful of time as well, but I wanted to show some real world applications to end with. During the pandemic, we did go viral together with the World Health Organization and the UN, and they were able to scale this much better than we could. So we were able to scale this to about 200 million people, this intervention, and became one of the most popular pages on the WHO website, which kind of concerned me in terms of what information people are looking at. But the idea was the same as bad news. Now you join a group called Not Co-Afraid, and lizard people behind coronavirus. You learn about fake experts that are peddling fake cures and conspiracies and emotional manipulation about vaccination, stuff like that. So I continue doing some campaigns for the WHO. I convinced them. So there was a funny story because they didn't. The name we wanted to give this game was Unmasked at the time to make light of the WHO masking fiasco, but also unmasking the manipulation techniques. They didn't think it was funny at all. They wanted, how do things go viral on the internet? But over the years, I've convinced them that funny is better and that you need to troll yourself so other people cannot troll you. Because the problem is that people love to troll the WHO. So I started doing these videos for the WHO where actually the idea was that we were going to troll Tedros, but I guess it ended up being me. But the idea was I start out washing a brain with the idea I'm going to brainwash you. And so, you take away the power from the trolls when you start, because they'll say, oh, pre-bunking, brainwashing. And so you sort of flip it around. So I continue to do that. This was actually taken down, go viral because the pandemic is over and the government, didn't want to support it anymore. So we created a new version called Bad Vax. Just came out in Scientific Reports. Bad Vax, very timely now for the US, was actually funded by the CDC prior to RFK Jr.'s arrival. So we haven't heard from them since, but thanks to CDC for funding it nonetheless, and the American Psychological Association. The idea here is that there are different characters, same as Bad News. Now it's Anne McDodell. Anne McDodell loves to tell you emotional anecdotes about vaccinations. There's Dr. Forge, who engages in pseudoscience, and Ali Natural, who has naturalistic fallacies, and Mystic Mac, the conspiracy mongerer. Um, and so again, same sort of scenario. We did a little meta-analysis on the results, on a good version and evil version to try to appeal to broader segments. Coming back to the student example, not everyone loves the evil version. So the good version ended up actually working slightly better, which was contrary to expectation. People share, better, more credible stuff, less likely to share misinfo, better information discernment, and so on. So it worked pretty well. We did one before Trump in the US election with Chris Krebs, who kept debunking Trump's first presidential claims about, the election being stolen. We were actually working on that campaign with Chris. Trying to secure the integrity of the election against foreign interference. We hadn't anticipated domestic conspiracy theories about the election. But same, it's sort of a playbook, right? Chris, who was the director of CISA, so the Cyberstructure and Security Agency in the US, came up with this wonderful metaphor about putting pineapple on pizza to explain foreign interference. So you're sort of like, pick an issue. Should you put pineapple on pizza? Oh, the Italians are going to be super offended if you put pineapple on pizza. And then the others say, oh, who are you to restrict my pizza topping freedom? Got my rights to top my pizza the American way or the Swedish way or whatever you wanna call it. I don't know, sausage maybe in Sweden. I don't know what to put in pizza. But the idea is that you use stereotypes to get people riled up. You buy bots, you amplify both sides, and that's the playbook. So we create a Harmony Square where you have an election caster and you see your influence on the election, and then we test people with polarizing stuff from social media. This really happened. Some Trump supporter and his kid were out and they were killed by, in a hunting accident. Somebody commented 1.5 less megabillies in the world. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. Again, not true, false, but it's very polarizing, not very nice. And so the idea is, how do people react? Again, inoculation, they find this stuff less reliable. They're more confident in their judgments and less likely to share the stuff on social media. Um, Extremism also has a playbook. This happened to be about jihadist extremism, but the same applies to right-wing extremists. They have this playbook, which we identify with partners. Identify vulnerable target, gain their trust, isolate them from friends and family, activate them to do something bad on behalf of the cause. And we used extremist recruitment on WhatsApp as an example. We're talking about disgusting people. They're out to hurt us if we don't stand up and do something. It's time to get going. It's all about loyalty. You can't trust anyone except us, right? Join our group. That's that sort of thing. And again, we actually did this with a partner in the Middle East in Lebanon. Well, they're based in Lebanon, but they had a charity they run in Iraq in areas formerly occupied by ISIS. Um, and we find that youth were able to better identify manipulative tactics. Again, some really interesting cultural nuances. Some of the things didn't replicate from our Western sample because, again, we didn't realize that they're better able to identify the techniques, but vulnerability wasn't obvious to them. Which, here, if you're unemployed and you're spending a lot of time online, that stands out as a vulnerability. But obviously, not being employed and not having much to do doesn't stand out in marginalized areas in those countries. And so actually we just have to shift our thinking about what that sort of means. And the last thing I want to talk about is Google. So Google contacted us and they said, look, inoculation, pre-bunking, this seems useful. But you keep running into this problem where people have to opt into your interventions, right? We want to help. This was at a time where social media companies were concerned, right? They wanted to help at this time, this years ago. And they said, look, we own YouTube. Those annoying ads that you can't skip on YouTube? What if we do the pre-bunk there? We create videos, 20-second videos like ads, and then we pre-bunk common manipulation techniques, and then we make them mandatory and scale them across billions of people all at once. Fantastic idea. I thought, let's do it. We created these videos. You may be targeted for warning. Here's what scapegoating looks like in a weakened example of unfairly blaming minority groups for society's problems. Here's some microdose examples of how you might spot this on the platform. Back in the day, I had to say like, oh, um, I don't know if there's misinformation on YouTube, and this may or may not be true, but I think we're long past the point where I start caring about NDAs. The the idea here is that we did lots of lab studies. And then Science Advances was like, okay, great, but you actually have to show that this works on YouTube. Took a year to convince the lawyers at YouTube to let us do this. So we were able to run a campaign, reaching millions of people with these videos. So Google had identified these as being common on YouTube. Emotional manipulation used by influencers, right? And political gurus who try to radicalize sometimes young men, but also other people. False dichotomy, scapegoating, ad hominem, right? And so we ran one campaign on YouTube. The control group saw a video about freezer burn. And in the lab studies, you get these elaborate tests, manipulative, non-manipulative, and then we look at discernment. And what's the weakened dose? So YouTube and Google said, look, we don't want the actual weakened dose. We want something that has zero harm potential because we don't want to be arbiters of truth and so and so. And so John Rosenbeek turned to popular culture, where surprisingly, a lot of these techniques can be found in popular culture. Of course, it's our popular culture in the sense that we went to Star Wars and South Park and um, uh, what's the Futurama, that type of stuff. Google did some focus groups with Gen Z later who were like, Star Wars, is this for old people? But it's still on TV. So we figured it'd be okay. So for the false dilemma, right? So it's about the structure of a false dilemma. So we used a clip from Anakin Skywalker who's talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi and says, if you're not with me, then you're my enemy. And then Skywalker goes on to become Darth Vader. They want to do a spoiler alert here. I'm not going to do the whole "Luke, I'm your father," but the idea is that Obi-Wan says only a Sith deals in absolutes, and then the narrator goes like, "Don't join the dark side. Don't use these manipulation techniques." Right? That's kind of the idea. But if you don't support automatic rifles, you're against the Second Amendment. If you support this country, you're against that country, right? These are all false dilemmas. They have the same exact structure. So we could find funny examples and get people, familiarize people with the template so that they can then spot it. And that was the idea. Why give illegal immigrant access to social services? We should be helping um, homeless Americans instead, right? False dilemma. Here's the neutral version. Why can't we do both? Right? Let's have a conversation. And so the idea was that you then get this test. Surprisingly, billion-dollar company can only do multiple choice testing on their platform, but that's all we had. Um, so 30% were randomly selected. But the interesting thing is that it was within 24 hours. So you saw this, 30-second ad, and then within 24 hours, you got the test. The median lapse was actually 12 hours between exposure and the test. So if you look at the lab effects, these were big for the videos in the lab for psychology. I mean, these are decently big effect sizes. But then when you look at the lab results, the field results, it was about a 5 to 10% boost on the lift, on the what they call a brand lift. So at first I was like, nah, that's pretty small, for real on YouTube when people are scrolling. But then I learned that companies spend millions on a 1% increase in brand recognition because they know that a 1% increase translates in X amount of sales. And so for a 30-second ad that costs almost nothing to do a boost of 5 to 10%, that was big for Google. And so they started rolling out this campaign in Germany, decontextualization, fear-mongering, whataboutism. And they replicated this on their own, similar effects. They did this during the EU elections. And then, of course, the political climate changed and all social media companies stopped implementing this. They stopped doing it. They didn't care anymore. They didn't want to, participate. So it's been a huge loss because they were the ones scaling this across the information environment. and they've stopped doing it. So that's been a big problem. We decided to try to continue this on our own. So on Instagram, we've developed a method where you can actually create control and treatment groups. So we target about, let's say, 500,000 people. Then we create a list of people who have watched our ad at least a few seconds, and then they're moved to a list. Then you can do proxy randomization by birth year on Instagram. So we assume that people born in January versus June don't differ in their ability to identify misinformation much. So we randomize by birth, which is a selection bias because not everyone declares their birth date on Instagram, but it's something. And then we randomize people to these videos ourselves. And so we ran a campaign with you got about 400 people in each group. It's hard to get people to do a quiz. So Instagram has a new sort of poll function. So you can show people an ad and then you can ask them one question afterwards. The lapse is now between a day and 6 days. But you can do it. But the interesting thing is people recognize fear mongering. The lift here is about 20 percent points on the campaign of identifying fear mongering on Instagram. Baseline discernment is bad in the control group. Only 38% of people can identify a very simple test of fear mongering on Instagram, which is kind of surprising. We also had behavior, information seeking. Are they clicking on our link? Click-through rates are very small on social media, but it tripled in the treatment condition in terms of the amount of people actually redirecting and clicking on the link. We did a handbook for NATO. We're now moving on to deepfakes, which is much harder, where we find some preliminary good results in helping people identify deepfakes. We're looking at election rumors, using AI to automate the pre-bunking using LLMs, which we've shown some success with. Biden used our template when we were still working with the State Department to pre-bunk the Russian invasion of Ukraine on a very large scale, which is the most real-world example I can give you, where they took our template, administered to the whole country, and there's no data on this. I mean, intelligence people say that, they they were able to throw off the playbook. They told people there were going to be, and they didn't know for sure. This was a US UK operation. They didn't know for sure if Putin was going to release fake videos showing Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil as a fake example of an invasion pretext. And they told people this is likely to be fake, right? They're trying to invade Ukraine. They're going to use this as an excuse. You're going to see actors that look like soldiers, sort of the whole pre-bunk. And they say that it derailed Putin's attempt. He had to find a new pretext, and it delayed the invasion by a couple of days, up to a week, which was useful for them. US disinformation people use this as one of the main pre-bunking examples that's been used by governments. We got it into the EU Digital Services Act for very large online platforms. We're now doing simulations work, just purely theoretical on herd immunity, right? So we have networks, and then we simulate broadcasting of misinformation. Different parts of the agents interact with each other. There's echo chamber formation over time. One of the main conclusions is that if you inoculate small minorities over time, it doesn't work very well. You have to inoculate a large part of the population up front in order to get good convergence in terms of herd immunity. Otherwise, it's just not enough. And that remains a challenge. We're using basic SIR, susceptible infected recovered models that are used for the spread of disease to introduce pre-bunking. Can we contain the spread of misinformation at population level, given empirically derived parameters for effect size, longevity, both debunking and pre-bunking? So you get peak disinformed, peak immunized. We can do scenario simulation, help policymakers think of different options. And if you want to know more, here's my own propaganda. Thanks so much, and hope that wasn't too much.